I was in the hallway outside my son's kitchen, coming to ask about dinner plans, when I heard my daughter-in-law, Vanessa, on the phone with her own mother, describing me plainly as a burden neither of us really wanted to take on. I stood there frozen, one hand still resting on the doorframe, listening to a specific coldness in her voice that told me this wasn't a passing frustration, but something she'd apparently been carrying and discussing for some time. I remember the specific smell of dinner cooking on the stove behind her, an ordinary domestic detail that made the coldness of her words land even more sharply against the otherwise unremarkable backdrop of an entirely normal Tuesday evening. I want to walk you through exactly what happened after I heard that sentence, in real detail, because I didn't storm into that kitchen, and I didn't simply pack a bag that same night either. What actually unfolded over the following months took me somewhere I never expected, and taught me something about family, pride, and rebuilding that I think matters to anyone hearing a version of what I heard that afternoon. I think many people watching this have overheard a similar comment from someone they love, spoken in a moment of private exhaustion they were never meant to hear, and I want to walk through exactly what I discovered about separating that raw hurt from the fuller, more complicated context underneath it. I spent 37 years teaching high school shop class, a career built around patient, practical instruction, watching generations of teenagers learn genuine skill and confidence, working with their hands under my guidance. I raised my son Gregory, largely alone after his mother passed when he was 13, working full teaching days while still managing every school event, every difficult teenage year, believing throughout those decades that the steady, patient effort I'd put in had built something genuinely solid between us. I remember specific weekend mornings from his own childhood, teaching him basic woodworking in our garage, the same patient instruction style I later brought to thousands of students, watching him build his first simple birdhouse with genuine, focused pride. I remember one specific Saturday when Gregory was 11, struggling with a joint that kept splitting no matter how carefully he sanded it, growing genuinely frustrated in a way that worried me at the time. I remember sitting beside him, not fixing it for him, but walking him through exactly what was going wrong, watching his frustration slowly transform into concentration and eventually genuine pride when he finally got it right on his own. That specific teaching philosophy, patience over correction, became the same approach I later brought to thousands of students across my career. My health began requiring more careful management about 2 years before that hallway moment, a combination of arthritis and early kidney concerns that made continuing to live entirely alone feel increasingly risky, prompting Gregory's genuine offer to move into their converted basement apartment. I'd accepted gratefully, understanding Vanessa's own initial hesitation as reasonable given how suddenly the arrangement had come together, but genuinely believing, based on our early interactions, that we'd eventually build the same kind of warm relationship I'd always managed with new people throughout my long teaching career. I remember the specific relief of that first week in their basement apartment, no longer worrying alone about managing my own increasingly complicated medical needs entirely by myself, genuinely grateful for the practical safety net their household provided during what had felt like an increasingly precarious period, living independently. The first several months living in their basement apartment felt cautiously warm, Vanessa initially reserved, but gradually opening up during shared dinners, asking genuine questions about my teaching career, my late wife, seeming to develop real interest in actually knowing me, rather than simply tolerating my presence. I remember specific evenings during that period, helping their young son with basic homework at the kitchen table, Vanessa watching with what I read, at the time, as genuine appreciation rather than the growing resentment I later learned had been quietly accumulating underneath. I remember one specific evening, Vanessa asking me directly about a particular woodworking technique she'd seen in a home renovation show, genuine curiosity in her voice that I took as real interest in actually knowing me as a person, not simply tolerating my presence in her household. I want to describe how the specific shift toward that overheard comment actually developed, because it didn't arrive suddenly but accumulated gradually across the following year, small moments I noticed without fully naming at the time. Vanessa's own mother had begun visiting more frequently during that same period, and I noticed, gradually, a specific tension developing around household space and privacy. Conversations about family time, increasingly framed in ways that seemed to carefully exclude my presence, though nothing was ever stated directly enough for me to address it clearly. I remember specific evenings during that shift, overhearing plans for weekend outings that no longer seemed to naturally include me the way they once had, small omissions that accumulated gradually, without any single moment I could point to as evidence of deliberate exclusion rather than simple, ordinary scheduling. I learned, eventually, more about what had actually prompted that specific phone call to Vanessa's mother, context that mattered considerably for understanding the fuller situation. Vanessa had been managing a genuinely difficult pregnancy with their second child during that period, physically exhausted and increasingly overwhelmed by the practical logistics of a household that now included a demanding toddler, a difficult pregnancy, and an aging father-in-law, requiring his own accumulating medical appointments and daily accommodations. I learned, eventually, that her pregnancy involved severe nausea, lasting well beyond the typical first trimester, combined with a toddler still requiring constant supervision, and Gregory's own demanding travel schedule that period. A specific combination of stresses that had genuinely pushed her past her own coping capacity, however unfair the resulting comment felt in isolation. I remember Gregory later confirming this fuller picture, describing evenings he'd return home from business trips to find Vanessa genuinely depleted, barely able to manage dinner for herself and their toddler, let alone the additional daily accommodations my own presence, however modest, still required of the household. I want to describe that hallway moment specifically, because the exact circumstances mattered as much as the general sentiment. Vanessa was describing, to her own mother, the accumulated exhaustion of managing everyone's needs simultaneously, and used the specific phrase, "a burden neither of us really wanted to take on," referring to my presence within that broader, genuinely overwhelming context, rather than as a standalone, isolated judgment about my worth as a person. I remember the specific tiredness in her voice as she said it, not cruel or calculating, simply the flat exhaustion of someone who'd been holding too much, for too long, and had finally, in a private moment with her own mother, allowed herself to voice the full weight of it out loud. I retreated to my basement apartment without ever knocking on that kitchen door, sitting on the edge of my bed for a long while, processing a specific, cold shock that combined genuine hurt with an uncomfortable recognition of tensions I'd perhaps sensed building without wanting to fully acknowledge them. I remember staring at my own hands during that long silence, hands that had spent decades teaching young people patient, careful craftsmanship, now simply sitting idle while I processed a wound that felt, in that moment, considerably harder to work through than any broken joint or splitting board I'd ever helped a struggling student repair. I understood, intellectually, that Vanessa's specific circumstances during that period, the difficult pregnancy, the demanding toddler, genuinely explained considerable exhaustion. Understanding that didn't fully soften the specific sting of hearing myself named so plainly as an unwanted weight within my own son's household. I remember thinking, sitting there alone, about that specific Saturday morning teaching Gregory to sand that stubborn joint decades earlier, wondering how the same patient, welcoming instinct that had defined my entire relationship with him had somehow led me here, to a basement apartment where I was apparently, at least in his wife's exhausted private moment, an unwanted weight. I want to describe those following weeks honestly, because the specific texture of my withdrawal mattered. I began spending considerably more time in my basement apartment, finding small excuses to skip family dinners, genuinely unable to sit at that table with Vanessa without replaying her specific words in my mind. Gregory noticed my sudden distance, appearing confused and hurt, though I didn't yet feel ready to explain what had actually prompted it. I remember one specific evening during that withdrawal, Gregory knocking gently on my basement door, asking if everything was all right, genuinely concerned but apparently unaware of the actual cause behind my distance. I told him I was simply tired, a small dishonesty that felt easier, in that moment, than fully explaining the specific wound his wife's overheard comment had created. I want to be honest about something uncomfortable during that period, because I think it matters for the fuller story. I recognized, gradually, that part of my specific hurt traced back to my own pride. A lifetime of being the patient, capable teacher, suddenly finding myself in the unfamiliar position of being someone else's genuine logistical challenge. That recognition didn't erase the legitimate hurt of Vanessa's specific words, but it did help me begin separating my wounded pride from the actual, practical question of what I genuinely wanted my remaining years to look like. I remember a specific conversation with an old teaching colleague during this period, someone I called simply to talk through the situation honestly. He reminded me, gently, that I'd spent decades teaching teenagers that struggling to admit you need help isn't weakness, and asked whether I was managing to extend myself the same grace I'd always so easily offered my students. About 6 weeks into that quiet withdrawal, I began seriously researching whether I had any genuine alternative to continued dependence on Gregory and Vanessa's household, understanding that continuing to occupy space where I apparently felt like an unwanted burden wasn't sustainable for anyone involved. My research led me toward retiring independently abroad, specifically the Philippines, discovering that my modest teaching pension could genuinely support independent living there, in a way it simply couldn't anymore in my own increasingly expensive hometown. I built an actual spreadsheet during that research period, applying the same careful, methodical approach I'd used throughout my entire teaching career, grading and organizing student work, comparing healthcare access specifically for my existing conditions, cost projections, and visa requirements, before allowing myself to fully commit to the idea as more than simply a wounded impulse. I want to address something directly, because I think it matters for the fuller story. I spent considerable time verifying, honestly with my own rheumatologist and nephrologist, whether my current health status genuinely supported independent living abroad, unwilling to make this decision purely from wounded pride, without confirming it was actually medically sound. Both specialists confirmed, after reviewing my full history, that my conditions were genuinely manageable, independently, with appropriate ongoing monitoring and access to reasonable local healthcare, information that gave me real confidence this wasn't simply an emotional reaction, but a legitimately viable path forward. I remember those specific appointments clearly, bringing detailed lists of questions to each one, wanting concrete, honest medical assessment rather than either false reassurance or overly cautious restriction. Both specialists' specific confirmation that I could manage my arthritis and kidney monitoring independently, provided I maintained regular check-ins, gave me exactly the evidence I needed to trust this decision as sound. Telling Gregory was difficult, understanding he'd likely interpret it, at least initially, as some form of rejection of him personally, rather than the genuine, considered decision it actually represented. I decided, ultimately, not to mention Vanessa's specific comment directly, telling him instead that I felt ready and medically cleared to build independent living arrangements again, letting the practical reasoning speak for itself rather than immediately burdening him with the specific hurt behind it, or forcing him into an uncomfortable position between his father and his wife. Gregory was genuinely surprised and visibly concerned, asking repeated questions about my health readiness, my financial planning, clearly worried this represented some form of premature, poorly considered decision rather than the carefully researched path it actually was. I answered his questions patiently, showing him my actual research, my specialist's clearance, my financial projections, demonstrating that this decision met exactly the kind of careful, responsible planning standard he himself valued in his own professional life. I remember the specific moment his expression shifted from worry to something closer to genuine respect, reviewing my documentation with careful attention, for telling me he hadn't expected such thorough preparation. An unspoken acknowledgement, I think, that this wasn't the impulsive decision he'd initially feared. He asked, near the end of that conversation, whether Vanessa's own behavior had contributed to my decision, a question I answered carefully, acknowledging genuine household tension without directly naming the specific overheard comment, still not ready at that point to place him in the difficult position of choosing between defending his father and defending his wife. I moved 11 months after that hallway moment, settling into a coastal community and beginning the deliberate process of building genuinely independent daily life again. No longer a logistical challenge woven into someone else's already overwhelming household, but simply a person managing his own affairs directly. I remember the specific relief of my first morning there, managing my own modest breakfast, my own medication schedule, my own entire day, with no overheard conversation anywhere nearby that might, even unintentionally, name me as an unwanted weight. I set up my own careful medication and monitoring schedule that first week, applying the same methodical discipline I'd once used organizing lesson plans and student progress records, understanding that maintaining this independence required genuine structure rather than simply hoping things would naturally work out on their own. Within 3 months, I'd established a genuine routine, regular gentle exercise recommended for my arthritis, and a modest volunteer role at a local community center, teaching basic woodworking to teenagers who couldn't otherwise easily access this kind of hands-on instruction. I remember the specific satisfaction of my first teaching session there, watching a shy 14-year-old boy build genuine confidence working with simple tools, applying decades of professional teaching skill I'd assumed had become entirely irrelevant to my daily life, discovering instead it remained genuinely valuable to an entirely new community of young people. I remember his specific transformation over just 3 sessions, arriving initially withdrawn and uncertain, gradually opening up as his skills developed, his mother later telling me she'd never seen him so genuinely proud of an accomplishment. That specific moment reminded me forcefully of exactly why I'd found such satisfaction teaching for 37 years, satisfaction I'd assumed, briefly and painfully, might have permanently ended along with my formal career. That teaching work gradually became the center of a genuine social circle, several other retirees and local community members who valued not just my practical instruction, but my actual company, evening gatherings that reminded me distinctly of the family warmth I'd once genuinely hoped for, before everything shifted so painfully. I found myself, within 6 months, with a fuller, more genuinely connected daily life than I'd experienced even during those early, cautiously warm months with Vanessa, a specific realization that surprised me, given how much I genuinely wanted that earlier relationship to work before it curdled into that overheard comment. I remember calling my old teaching colleague, the same one whose gentle question about self-compassion had first helped me separate wounded pride from genuine planning, telling him honestly that I felt more like myself again than I had in over a year. He told me he wasn't surprised, reminding me that he'd always known my particular gift for teaching would find somewhere new to matter, regardless of the specific circumstances that had originally pushed me to look for it. Gregory visited alone about 9 months after my move, and during that visit, I finally told him honestly about the hallway comment. Understanding enough distance and genuine healing had occurred that the conversation could happen without either of us being overwhelmed by raw hurt or defensive loyalty toward Vanessa. He was genuinely devastated learning I'd heard that specific characterization, explaining, once he'd had time to process it, the full context of Vanessa's difficult pregnancy and accumulated exhaustion during that period, context I hadn't fully understood at the time I overheard her words. I remember watching his face during that conversation, genuine horror settling in as he began to understand fully how deeply that specific comment had reshaped my final months in their household, processing, in real time, the specific gap between his wife's momentary, exhausted honesty and the devastating weight it had actually carried for me. Vanessa called me directly about 2 weeks after Gregory's visit, her voice carrying genuine, considerable remorse, explaining her own perspective on that difficult period, the exhaustion, the hormonal difficulty of that pregnancy, and her own shame at having voiced something so painful about a father-in-law she'd genuinely never wanted to hurt. I told her honestly that I understood the circumstances now more fully, and that hearing her own genuine remorse, rather than simple justification, mattered considerably to how I now understood that entire difficult period. I remember her voice breaking slightly during that call, describing specific nights during her pregnancy where she'd cried from sheer exhaustion, genuinely ashamed that her own private venting had ended up wounding someone she'd actually grown to care about, even if that growing affection hadn't yet been fully visible in her day-to-day exhausted behavior at the time. Vanessa told me something during that same call I've held on to since, admitting that watching me build this entirely new, genuinely thriving independent life had taught her something important about how private exhaustion, however genuine, can still land with devastating clarity on someone overhearing it, regardless of the surrounding context that seemed to explain it in the moment. She said she'd since become considerably more careful about discussing family stress even privately, understanding now how thin the walls of a shared household actually are, and how much weight even a context-dependent comment can carry when heard by the person it describes. She mentioned, specifically, that her own mother had actually gently pushed back on her during that original call, suggesting she find a kinder way to discuss the situation, advice Vanessa admitted she hadn't taken seriously in the moment, too exhausted to fully absorb it, though she said she thinks about her mother's specific gentle correction often now, wishing she'd listened more carefully the first time around. About a year into my time here, the local community centre asked whether I'd be willing to develop a more formal, structured woodworking curriculum, training other volunteers alongside me, expanding my contribution considerably beyond the individual sessions I'd originally been providing alone. I accepted, understanding the specific significance of that request, that the community I'd originally joined, simply seeking my own restored purpose, had come to genuinely value my accumulated professional expertise, precisely the kind of recognition that overheard comment had, however contextually explainable, failed to extend to me during those difficult final months in that basement apartment. I now train nearly 10 volunteers regularly, developing a genuine structured curriculum from decades of professional teaching experience I'd assumed, briefly, had become permanently irrelevant once my formal career ended. Watching those volunteers grow more confident guiding their own students, applying lessons I'd taught them to genuinely help their own community's teenagers, produces a specific satisfaction I don't think any amount of comfortable, overwhelmed dependence back in that basement apartment could have provided. If you've overheard a similar word, burden, or any variation, spoken by a family member you genuinely hoped to build closeness with, I want to tell you what this experience taught me. That word, however painful, often reflects a specific moment of genuine, overwhelming circumstance, rather than someone's complete, permanent assessment of your worth. But I'd also encourage you not to simply accept and internalize it either, understanding that finding your own path back toward genuine, active contribution, wherever that path leads, matters more than either confronting the person who said it or quietly absorbing it as permanent truth about who you actually are. I'd specifically recommend verifying honestly with your own doctors whether independent living genuinely remains medically viable for you, the way I did before committing to my own decision. That concrete medical confirmation gave me confidence this wasn't merely a wounded emotional reaction, but a legitimately sound path I could pursue with genuine confidence, rather than lingering doubt. I'd also encourage you to consider, honestly, the fuller context surrounding the comment, the way I eventually did with Vanessa's circumstances, before deciding whether the situation calls for major restructuring or simply an honest conversation once both people have had time to genuinely rest and reflect. Not every painful word reflects the same underlying reality, and understanding the specific difference matters considerably for choosing the right path forward. I still lead my structured woodworking curriculum most weeks, still manage my own entirely independent daily life, still feel, most days, the specific satisfaction of being genuinely valued and useful that I'd assumed, briefly and painfully, might have permanently ended the moment I overheard myself named, so plainly, as an unwanted weight. Gregory, Vanessa, and both grandchildren visited together last spring, my first time meeting their newborn daughter in person, and I watched Vanessa relax, genuinely throughout that entire visit, watching me teach, watching my grandson build his own first simple project under my patient instruction, a specific echo of teaching Gregory the same basic skills decades earlier. I remember one particular afternoon during that visit, Vanessa asking if she could join one of my teaching sessions herself, genuinely curious rather than simply accommodating my interests the way she might have during those earlier, more strained months. Watching her work alongside her own son, learning basic woodworking together, felt like its own quiet, meaningful proof of exactly how completely our relationship had transformed since that original difficult period. She struggled, genuinely, with a basic joining technique I'd taught countless students over the decades, and I remember the specific patience I extended her, the same patience I'd once shown Gregory, struggling with that stubborn joint as a boy, watching her frustrations slowly give way to genuine, focused concentration, exactly the way his once had. By the end of that session, she'd built something simple but genuinely her own, holding it up with visible pride, telling me she finally understood why I'd found teaching so meaningful across an entire career. If you're sitting somewhere right now, feeling exactly the way that overheard comment once made me feel, I hope you find your own version of what I eventually built. Not just independence, but the specific, genuine sense of continued purpose that no amount of careful, overwhelmed family accommodation can substitute for. I keep a small photo from my very first teaching session pinned above my desk here, alongside a newer one from Vanessa's visit. A reminder that a single difficult, context-driven word doesn't have to define what comes after it. I'll see you in the next one. Vanessa told me something more recently, nearly 2 years after that original comment, that I've held on to since. She'd started, since our reconciliation, actively defending elderly relatives in conversations with her own friends, specifically pushing back whenever she heard someone describe an aging parent primarily through the lens of logistical burden rather than genuine personhood. She said watching me rebuild an entirely thriving independent life had permanently changed how she thinks about aging family members generally, not just about me specifically. I want to close with a specific moment from that same visit, meeting my newest granddaughter for the first time, watching my grandson, now 9, patiently show his baby sister the small wooden toy I'd built and shipped for her earlier that year, explaining to her, with genuine seriousness, exactly how Grandpa Ambrose had made it, repeating instructions I'd once given him during our own sessions together, a specific echo of teaching passed down another generation, exactly the kind of continuation I'd feared, briefly and painfully, might have ended entirely the day I overheard myself named as an unwanted burden. If you're currently carrying your own version of that overheard word, spoken by someone genuinely overwhelmed rather than genuinely cruel, I hope you find your own path toward both independent rebuilding and eventual, honest reconciliation, the way Vanessa and I eventually managed together. Context matters, genuine remorse matters, and continued contribution matters most of all. I'll see you in the next one.